A grandmother was found dead inside her flat. Police rushed to Bath Road in Hounslow. At first, the call sounded like a medical emergency, but something about the scene quickly raised questions. Officers arrived shortly after 10 a.m. on Sunday morning. The address sat near Heathrow Airport in West London. Inside the flat, they found 71-year-old Elena Poltorak. She had suffered serious injuries inside the property. Paramedics from London Ambulance Service tried to help, but she was pronounced dead at the scene. Then silence. Police sealed off the Bath Road address. Crime scene tape surrounded the residential building entrance. Neighbours watched as officers moved in and out. Many described her as quiet, friendly, and well-dressed. One neighbour called her the perfect neighbour. Another said she always greeted people warmly. Moments later, detectives began asking questions. Then movement. The Metropolitan Police launched a full murder investigation. Specialist Crime Command detectives took over the case. Officers confirmed the injuries were significant, but investigators have not yet confirmed how they happened. No arrests have been made so far. Extra police patrols were deployed across the area. Local residents were urged to stay alert. Police are asking anyone near Bath Road to come forward. Even small information could prove vital. For now, the investigation continues in Hounslow, and detectives say they are keeping every possibility open.
The call came in just after 10 a.m. on a quiet Sunday morning, one of those ordinary moments that, without warning, fractures into something unthinkable. On Bath Road in Hounslow, a residential street where life typically moves at a predictable pace, something had gone terribly wrong. Behind the doors of an unassuming home, a 71-year-old woman lay with injuries so severe that even the rapid response of the London Ambulance Service could not save her. By the time emergency crews arrived, the outcome had already been sealed. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Within hours, what began as a medical emergency call transformed into something far more sinister. Detectives from the Metropolitan Police Service Specialist Crime Command stepped in, and the reality became unavoidable. This was no accident. This was a murder investigation. A life had been violently taken, and somewhere beyond the police tape, the answers were waiting. Who was she? What happened inside that home? And perhaps most chilling of all, who was responsible? As officers secured the scene and forensic teams began their meticulous work, a quiet street became the center of a growing investigation. Neighbors watched from behind curtains. Police vehicles lined the road, and an unsettling tension settled over the area, the kind that lingers long after sirens fade. Leading the case is Detective Chief Inspector Matthew Denby, a man now tasked with unraveling the final moments of a woman whose death has left more questions than answers. In his first public statement, he described the incident as tragic, but behind that word lies a deeper urgency, a recognition that somewhere, someone knows more than they're saying. Because in cases like this, the smallest detail can crack everything open. A sound heard through the wall. A figure seen passing by. A moment that seemed insignificant until now. And so the appeal goes out. Detectives are asking anyone who was in the Bath Road area that morning, anyone who saw something unusual, heard something out of place, noticed anything at all, to come forward. Because what happened inside that house didn't occur in isolation. Crimes like this leave traces, on streets, in memories, in overlooked fragments of time. For now, there have been no arrests, which means the person responsible could still be out there, watching, waiting, blending back into normal life as if nothing happened. But behind the scenes, the investigation is only just beginning. Every piece of evidence, every timeline, every connection is being examined. And as the hours turn into days, one thing becomes clear. This is more than just a case. It's a race against silence. The first hours of any murder investigation are the most fragile, where confusion, urgency, and instinct collide. And on that Sunday morning in Hounslow, as the reality of what had happened began to settle in, Bath Road transformed into something unrecognizable. Blue lights washed over brick walls. Police tape stretched across pavements that, just hours earlier, had been walked by neighbors heading to shops, to church, or simply enjoying the quiet rhythm of a weekend morning. Now, every movement was controlled, every step deliberate. Inside the house, time seemed to stand still. Forensic officers moved carefully through each room, documenting, collecting, preserving. Every surface became a question, every object a potential witness. The air itself felt heavy, as if the walls carried echoes of what had unfolded. The woman, 71 years old, was no longer just a victim. She was now the center of a growing investigation, one that would begin by asking the most fundamental question: what exactly happened inside this home? There were no immediate answers. No suspect waiting to be taken into custody. No clear narrative tying the morning together. Just silence and the unsettling weight of uncertainty. Outside, neighbors gathered in cautious clusters, speaking in hushed tones. Some had seen the emergency vehicles arrive. Others had only noticed the sudden shift, the way the street no longer felt like itself. One resident who had lived on Bath Road for over a decade would later describe the moment as surreal. The kind of morning where nothing seems out of place until suddenly everything is. Because nothing about this case, at least in the beginning, pointed clearly in one direction. There were no reports of forced entry released to the public, no immediate indication of a struggle spilling into the street. Whatever had happened, it had been contained within the walls of that house. And that raised a chilling possibility. Was this a random act of violence? Or something far more personal? Detectives from the Metropolitan Police Service Specialist Crime Command began building a timeline, minute by minute, detail by detail. They retraced the morning as best they could. At approximately 10:00 a.m., the call came in. Reports of a woman with significant injuries. The exact nature of those injuries had not yet been publicly disclosed, but investigators already knew they were dealing with something severe, something that pointed unmistakably toward foul play. Paramedics arrived quickly. They did what they could, but it wasn't enough. And now the question became, how long had she been like that before help arrived? Was the attack recent? Or had precious time already slipped away before anyone realized something was wrong? Detectives canvassed the area, knocking on doors, asking the same careful questions. Did you see anything unusual this morning? Did you hear any disturbances? Anyone unfamiliar in the area? At first, the answers were frustratingly ordinary. No, nothing out of the usual. It was quiet. Too quiet. Because in a case like this, silence doesn't simplify things, it complicates them. It suggests one of two possibilities. Either the crime happened so quickly, so discreetly, that it left no obvious trace, or it occurred in a way that didn't immediately raise alarm. And that second possibility led investigators down a different path of thinking. What if the victim knew the person responsible? Inside the house, forensic teams focused on reconstructing the final moments, patterns of movement, signs of struggle, the position of objects that might have been disturbed. Each detail mattered. A chair slightly out of place. A door left ajar. An item missing, or perhaps something left behind. Because often, it's not what's obvious that solves a case. It's what feels just slightly wrong. Meanwhile, Detective Chief Inspector Matthew Denby faced the difficult task of leading both an investigation and a community response. His statement to the public was measured, but behind it lay the urgency of a case that had already begun to draw attention. A woman had been killed in her own home, and the person responsible had not yet been found. That reality changes everything. Police presence in the area increased almost immediately. Uniformed officers patrolled the streets, not just to gather information, but to reassure residents, though reassurance is a difficult thing to provide when answers are still out of reach. For many living nearby, the sense of safety had been shaken. If something like this could happen here, in broad daylight, what did it mean for everyone else? As the day turned into evening, investigators began piecing together the victim's life, who she was, how she lived, who she spoke to, the routines that defined her days. Because understanding a victim is often the key to understanding the crime. Was she someone who kept to herself? Did she have regular visitors? Was there anyone who might have had a reason, any reason at all, to harm her? Family members had been notified. Specially trained officers were assigned to support them, guiding them through the initial shock and grief. Behind closed doors, conversations began, careful, sensitive, but necessary. When was the last time anyone spoke to her? Did she mention any concerns? Anything unusual in recent days? Every answer added a piece to the puzzle. But puzzles like this rarely come together quickly. Back on Bath Road, the scene remained active well into the night. Lights illuminated the property as forensic teams continued their work, refusing to rush, refusing to miss anything that could later prove critical. Because once a scene is released, it can never be recreated. And somewhere within that house, there was a truth waiting to be uncovered. A sequence of events. A moment of violence. A reason, hidden, buried, or perhaps painfully obvious once seen clearly. But for now, it remained just out of reach. And perhaps most unsettling of all, there were still no arrests. No one in custody. No confirmed suspect. No clear explanation. Just a growing investigation and a widening circle of questions. As the first 24 hours came to a close, one thing had become certain. This was not going to be a straightforward case. Because when a crime leaves behind so little noise, it often means the real story is far more complicated than it first appears. And somewhere, just beyond what anyone could yet see, the truth was waiting. The second day began not with answers, but with pressure. By early morning, Bath Road was no longer just a sealed-off crime scene. It had become the focal point of an investigation that was quietly intensifying behind the scenes. Detectives knew something the public did not yet fully grasp. Time was already working against them. Because in cases like this, the longer a suspect remains unidentified, the colder the trail becomes. Inside the investigation room, officers from the Metropolitan Police Service Specialist Crime Command began assembling the first real framework of the case. A timeline board filled with fragments, times, movements, names, unanswered questions. Each pinned detail represented a possibility, but none yet formed a complete picture. The victim's final 48 hours became the immediate focus. Where had she been? Who had she spoken to? What had changed, if anything, leading up to that Sunday morning? Phone records were requested. CCTV from nearby roads and properties was being collected. Officers expanded their door-to-door inquiries, this time asking more specific questions, probing not just for what people saw, but for what they might have overlooked. Because often, witnesses don't realize what they know until they're asked the right question. And then something shifted. A neighbor, initially unsure if what they noticed was relevant, mentioned a detail that hadn't come up before. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't immediately suspicious, but it was different. An unfamiliar presence. Someone who didn't quite belong to the rhythm of the street. Detectives leaned in. What time? What did they look like? Were they alone? The description was vague, frustratingly so, but it was something, and in an investigation built on silence, something is everything. Officers began cross-referencing the time frame with available CCTV. Cameras mounted on nearby shops, traffic systems, even private doorbell footage, each one a potential piece of the puzzle. Hours of footage, faces passing by, cars moving in and out, normal life unfolding frame by frame. Until eventually, patterns begin to emerge. But patterns require patience. Back at the scene, forensic analysis continued to reveal more subtle details, details that wouldn't be visible to the naked eye. Blood pattern analysis, trace evidence, points of contact. And slowly, a picture began to take shape. There were indications of a struggle. Not chaotic but controlled. Which raised an unsettling question. Was this an attack driven by panic? Or one carried out with intent? Because there's a difference. One is explosive, unpredictable. The other deliberate. And as investigators studied the layout of the house, the positioning of key evidence, and the nature of the injuries, they began to consider a possibility that would shift the entire direction of the case. What if this wasn't random at all? What if the person responsible had been inside that house before? That theory changed everything. It narrowed the field. It redirected the questions. It turned attention toward relationships, past and present. Friends, family, care providers, anyone with access. Detective Chief Inspector Matthew Denby knew this phase well. It's where investigations become more personal, where names replace unknowns, and where every connection must be examined with uncomfortable precision. Background checks began. Known associates were identified. Alibis quietly verified. Not accusations, just procedure. But procedure in a case like this can feel like suspicion. Meanwhile, the public appeal continued. Officers released updated statements, urging anyone who had been in the Bath Road area that morning to come forward. Even the smallest detail, they emphasized, could prove critical. Because somewhere out there, someone might be holding onto a memory they don't yet realize matters. A car parked briefly where it shouldn't have been. A figure moving with purpose. A moment that felt off. And then there was the question that lingered over everything. Why? Because motive, even more than identity, defines the direction of a case. Was this about gain? Revenge? Opportunity? Or something more complex, something rooted in history? As the investigation deepened, officers began to examine the victim's personal circumstances more closely. Financial records, recent communications, any sign of tension, conflict, or vulnerability. But so far, nothing obvious surfaced. No clear threats. No recent disputes made public. No immediate explanation for such violence. And that absence of motive, of clarity, only made the case more unsettling. Because when there's no clear reason, it forces detectives to look harder, to question assumptions, to revisit details that might otherwise be dismissed. By the end of the second day, the investigation had grown, but it had not yet broken through. There were leads but no conclusions, possibilities but no certainty, and still no arrests, which meant that somewhere, beyond the police lines and public statements, the person responsible was still unaccounted for. Perhaps watching the news, perhaps listening to the appeals, perhaps believing they had done enough to disappear. But investigations like this don't fade. They build, piece by piece, detail by detail, until eventually something gives. And when it does, it rarely happens quietly. Because the truth, no matter how carefully hidden, has a way of forcing itself into the light. And on Bath Road, that moment was getting closer. By the third day, the investigation had entered a new phase, one where quiet groundwork began to collide with emerging direction. Inside the incident room, the board was no longer just a collection of fragments. It had structure now, lines drawn between names, timelines tightening, movements beginning to overlap in ways that could no longer be ignored. What once looked like scattered pieces were starting to connect. Detectives from the Metropolitan Police Service had spent hours reviewing CCTV, isolating key windows of time, particularly the period leading up to the 10:00 a.m. emergency call. And within that window, something had begun to stand out. A gap, not in footage, but in expectation. A period of time where, based on what they knew about the victim's routine, something should have happened, but didn't. No visible movement. No sign of activity. Just absence. And absence in an investigation like this can be as revealing as presence. Because it suggests interruption. It suggests that whatever occurred inside that house may have happened earlier than first assumed. That realization shifted everything again. If the attack didn't happen close to the time of the call, then who made the call? And more importantly, why then? That question alone forced detectives to revisit the sequence from the beginning. The call logs were pulled apart. The timing re-examined. The language used by the caller carefully analyzed. Every word matters. Tone, packing, urgency. Because sometimes, what someone says is less important than how they say it. At the same time, forensic results began to return slowly, but with increasing significance. While full details remained tightly held within the investigation, certain conclusions were becoming difficult to ignore. There were no signs of forced entry. That fact, more than any other, narrowed the field dramatically. Whoever had been inside that house had likely been allowed in, or had access. And access is never random. It belongs to someone. Suddenly, the focus sharpened. Detectives began prioritizing individuals within the victim's immediate and extended circle, people who could move through that front door without raising alarm. Friends who visited regularly. Relatives who checked in. Service providers. Anyone with familiarity. Interviews became more direct. Not confrontational, but precise. Where were you that morning? When did you last see her? Did anything seem unusual? And as answers came in, they were tested quietly, methodically. Alibis were compared against data, movements cross-checked with digital footprints, timelines either held or began to crack. Because the truth, when pressured, doesn't always stay intact. Meanwhile, back on Bath Road, the police presence had shifted. Fewer officers now, but a more targeted approach. The visible intensity had softened, but behind the scenes the work had only deepened. Residents, however, still felt it. That lingering tension. The awareness that something unresolved was sitting just beneath the surface of their everyday lives. People locked doors a little earlier. Paid closer attention to unfamiliar faces. Replayed that Sunday morning in their minds, searching for anything they might have missed. Because now, it wasn't just about what had happened. It was about who, and whether that person had been closer than anyone realized. Detective Chief Inspector Matthew Denby continued to guide the investigation with a careful balance, maintaining public engagement while protecting the integrity of the case. Another appeal was prepared. Not broader but sharper. This time focusing on specific hours, specific movements, specific gaps. Because at this stage, investigators weren't just asking for information. They were testing what they already suspected. And then quietly, without announcement, something changed. A detail. Small on its own, but impossible to ignore in context. It came from within the evidence. Not dramatic, not obvious, but consistent. And consistency builds confidence. The kind of confidence that allows detectives to shift from asking what happened to considering who did it. But even then, caution remained. because suspicion is not proof. And in a case with no arrests, no public suspect, and no clear motive, every step forward had to be measured. Careful. Defensible. Still, the direction was no longer as uncertain as it had been in those first hours. There was now a working theory, one that suggested this was not a random act, not a crime of chance, but something far more contained, far more deliberate, and potentially far closer to home. As the investigation moved toward its next stage, the stakes shifted once again. Because identifying a suspect is one thing, proving it is another entirely. And somewhere within the growing body of evidence, detectives believed the truth was already there, waiting to be fully uncovered. But until that moment came, one fact remained unchanged. A woman had been killed in her own home, and the person responsible still hadn't been named.